Our first presentation this evening is Spencer Logan. Spencer began skiing in northern Colorado and began learning about avalanches in northern Utah. He continued his avalanche education in southern Montana and earned an MS in Earth Sciences from Montana State University. Spencer joined the CAIC in 2004. He's collaborated with colleagues from the CAIC, North America, and Europe to better understand trends and patterns in avalanche accidents and occurrences. His kids are the fourth generation of the family to ski and the fifth to fish in Colorado. The title of his presentation tonight is Avalanche Fatalities in 2020-21. The past avalanche season was the deadliest in nearly a century. What factors made the season so exceptional, and how is it similar to previous years? His presentation will examine last season in the context of longer trends and patterns of avalanche accidents, the unstable snowpack conditions spread across the Western US, and the background of the COVID pandemic. Thank you, Spencer.
Thanks, Scott. And that feels like a lot to live up to. But as Scott said, I'm going to talk about last winter's avalanche accidents across the US. And before I dive in, you may be asking yourself, why this guy? It's a pretty good question, and one that I do ask myself occasionally. In the 1960s and early 70s, ski areas operating on Forest Service lands reported avalanche events to the US Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. Along with the avalanches was data on involvements, close calls, and deaths. The Colorado Avalanche Warning Program began issuing avalanche information to the public in the early 1970s as part of the research station. And the warning program continued to collect avalanche data from the rest of the US. This photo is state-of-the-art equipment in 1975. Phones in a big recording box, real-time weather data traced onto paper rolls, and a teletype for sending out bulletins. Building on work that snow ranger Dale Gallagher had started in 1968, the Colorado program published accident compilations through the mid-90s. More recently, the American Avalanche Association has published another volume with the CAIC's involvement. The CAIC has continued to compile information on avalanche accidents, and we maintain the Central Archive of Avalanche Deaths in the United States, which I've managed for over the past 10 years. This doesn't make me an expert on accidents, but as a researcher interested in patterns and trends, it does mean I'm in a good position to discuss these questions about last winter's accidents and build towards the how and why last season was exceptional from an accident perspective. So let's start with this. 37. That's the number of people killed by avalanches in the United States last winter. It's the greatest loss of life in modern history. We can find much worse seasons prior to World War II, like the March 1st, 1910 avalanche near Stevens Pass that killed 96 people in a single event. But since World War II, recreation has become increasingly important. And if we look at avalanche accidents since 1950, we see the influence of recreation. Here are US avalanche deaths by winter since 1950-51 on the left through last season. The avalanche year starts October 1st and runs through September 30th of the following year. And we use the ending year as the number. So last season, avalanche year 2021 ended 2.5 weeks ago and was the worst since 1950. There's an increase in avalanche deaths in the 1970s as cross-country skiing and backcountry skiing boomed. Then you can see another recreation-related increase in the 90s as snowmobiles got more powerful, mountain sleds got better, and more people started exploring in the winter backcountry. Now, since the early 2000s, the number of people killed in avalanches has remained fairly steady. We see lots of variation from year to year, which you see reflected in that 5-year moving average, or the red line. But overall, we're not seeing dramatic increases or decreases in the number of people killed by avalanches. So if last year was the greatest, but not exceptional, let's take a look at where the accidents occurred. Here are the avalanche deaths by state for the previous 10 years on the left and last season on the right. we see a pretty similar pattern. The deaths are concentrated in Colorado or Utah. In Colorado, last winter tied for the greatest number of deaths in recent history. Utah's season tied for the second worst in recent history. Interestingly, accidents weren't that bad in the Pacific Northwest, despite the dangerous avalanche conditions in February. And I want to tackle the when as well, because it's closely related to the where. Here are the avalanche dangers across the Western US from January 15th through March 15th. This data is courtesy of the National Avalanche Center. The grid is arranged from the coast with the Pacific Northwest on the top to the continental snowpacks of Wyoming and Colorado on the bottom. January was dry for most of the Western US, and we saw extended periods of low or moderate danger. Storms at the end of January quickly ramped up the avalanche danger. Avalanche fatalities followed, and between January 28th and February 3rd, we saw the most deaths in any 7-day period since 1950. The unstable conditions and avalanche accidents continued through February, and we finished the month recording the most avalanche deaths in the US within a month. Fortunately, the unstable conditions settled out in March. Here's how those accidents played out on a timeline. It starts October 1st, 2020, and runs through June 1st, 2021. Last season's cumulative fatalities are in blue. It's the running total of avalanche deaths last winter. The red line indicates the cumulative median deaths over the previous 10 winters, while the orange lines indicate the 25th and 75th percentiles. The orange and red lines give us an indication of how recent typical seasons progress. Over the last 10 seasons, number of avalanche deaths increased fairly regularly through January and February, with an increase in rate, meaning more accidents in early March. The steepness of the blue line in February of last year indicates how extraordinary that month was compared to previous recent seasons. And not only were there so many accidents, but there was an unusual number of accidents with multiple victims in a short period of time. It started with this accident in southern Colorado that killed 3 backcountry tourers. And the following day, an accident in Alaska where an avalanche ran through this narrow chute and killed 3 climbers. And then a few days later, the avalanche in northern Utah that killed 4. It was a brutal start to a brutal month that would leave huge holes in our backcountry community. But while those accidents hit in close succession, by the end of the season, the number of multiple victim accidents was not too far out of line of previous seasons. In this bubble plot, each season is a column with the last winter in blue. Height of the bubbles indicates the number of victims within an accident, and the size of the bubble is scaled to the number of accidents. Last season only had 1 accident with 2 victims, 2 accidents with 3 victims, and 1 accident with 4 deaths. That was bad, but it was similar compared to 2012, 2013, or 2014. So let's take a look at who died in avalanches last year. Here are snapshots of the 12 men who died in Colorado. As we pull back and look at the patterns, I don't want to appear that I'm minimizing these individual losses. But when we look at last year compared to the previous 10 winters, we see a similar proportion of motorized versus non-motorized users. Snowmobilers didn't account for an unusual proportion of deaths last year. When we look at non-motorized users, there was a higher than typical proportion of backcountry tourers and fewer folks who left the ski area for the backcountry or side country riders. Last year, the avalanche victims were older, with a median age of 44 compared to the median age of 34 between 1990 and in 2018. And last year's victims tended to be relatively experienced at their sport, rather than novices new to the game. Dr. Eric Peich with the USGS has done some interesting research looking at the increase in age of avalanche victims through time. He has suggested that many of the experienced victims have had avalanche training, but it was not in recent years. And as you get older, factors like time pressure or outside demands could be playing a role. Throughout the accidents, we see a common pattern of underestimating the potential avalanches given the unstable snowpack. So if we go back to this plot, The shallow, dry weather in January and earlier meant widespread persistent weak layers across most of the western US. When those weak layers were loaded in late January through February, avalanches were propagating wider and running further than many people had recent experience with. That was certainly a factor in the Wilson Glade accident in Utah. On the day of the accident, the avalanche danger was rated high, but two parties independently converged in this terrain because they felt it was safer. This photo from the Utah Avalanche Center shows measured slope angles across the slope, and you can see many areas of this slope are in that prime range for avalanching. And in Colorado, we saw avalanches covering areas that had become high trafficked in recent seasons. These avalanches were running further and out of recent experience. And we may have even seen an example in this close call near Stevens Pass, where the unusual conditions may have caught people off guard. Two parties were ascending an established skin track when the slope avalanched, and the slope had already been skied. Pretty unusual conditions for the Northwest. So we've built to the how and why. An unstable snowpack across much of the West, here described in the Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Center bulletin as untrustworthy. And unusual avalanches out of many users' recent experiences. But it wasn't just the unusual avalanches. There's a reason I'm joining you from 10,000 feet in Leadville, Colorado, and you're watching this presentation on a video screen. All these accidents and unusual avalanches were occurring against the backdrop of COVID and the global pandemic. People flocked to the mountains, crowding our ski areas and trailheads. The National Avalanche Center estimated backcountry recreation increased 50 to 100% in many areas. That's a huge influx of people. And while we didn't see that huge influx of inexperienced people becoming involved in avalanches, as some folks worried would happen, all those users may have pushed some of these more experienced folks further out, or the experienced folks were willing to venture further to find the backcountry experience they were after. We know that when people are pressured or tired, they fall back on heuristics or simple rules that have helped us make decisions previously. So you can imagine developing patterns and practices over recent seasons, and those rules not being successful or as safe in last season's unusual conditions. And we know that COVID complicated many things. This is a photo of a fatal avalanche in Utah on January 30th. One skier was caught and killed when he decided, mid-slope, to ski off the tree-covered ridge that he had planned to descend. Later, his surviving partner said, quote, "I want to share my belief that COVID had an impact on this accident. I realize now that I am exhausted from the 10+ months of near constant stress COVID brings, with worry about my family, my friends, my work, etc., plus financial stress, school closures, no physical contact with family members, friends, and so forth. As a result, my typical training, motivation, and mental reflection has been much less than a normal fall or winter." So as Dr. Carl Berkland has said, last season was tragic because we saw the intersection of unstable snow and the global pandemic. So as we look forward towards next season, we're still dealing with pandemic-related issues, but we can hope for soft and stable snow. I'll take all the credit for ideas that you don't agree with or object to. Ideas in this talk that resonate or sound right come from my colleagues here in Colorado and across the West, especially the CAIC staff, Carl Berkland and Simon Troutman, National Avalanche Center, and former CAIC forecaster Dale Atkins. Thanks for your attention tonight, and we've got time for questions.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Spencer. That was a season to remember. One question that I had, as you mentioned, a lot of last year's fatalities occurred with, experienced and very experienced users. And I remember watching last year's public statement that that Ethan Green, the CAIC director, had put out, and he had made a comment that, you know, this was a 1 in 10 year cycle, and you might be an experienced backcountry skier, and if you hadn't, you know, skied more than 10 years, this is a cycle that you may never have experienced, even though you've been out quite a few years and have a lot of days under your belt. And I'm just wondering, I mean, you've been forecasting for a long time and obviously dealt with quite a few challenging cycles over your career. I'm wondering if you've just got any, like, I don't know, pro tips for experienced backcountry users for things to be keying in on with your public forecasts that really should, you know, like, should resonate or be more impactful around, like, hey, this is a time when you want to kind of ratchet it back. Are there any things you'd add to last year, and maybe messaging we should be really acutely listening to?
Yeah, in Colorado, we recognized fairly early in the winter that we were dealing with a 1 in 10 year condition. You know, Colorado often has weak layers at the bottom of the snowpack. We often have persistent weak layers that plague us through the winter. So it wasn't unusual in that way, but you know, it was easy for us to look back and say, this is a really similar winter to 2012. This is a really similar winter to 06. And begin to say, you know, what you've been doing in the last few years may not be working. And especially with the growth we've seen in backcountry recreation, you know, people are going new places or pushing into areas. And if you've had a couple stable seasons, you start drifting into areas that may not be that safe, or, you know, are in the bottom of run out zones.
Yeah.
And, you know, you move further north, and forecasters in Idaho said they were dealing with a 1 in 30 year snowpack. You know, places in Montana were dealing with somewhere between a 1 in 10 and a 1 in 20 year snowpack.
Right.
So you start widening that window, and there's fewer and fewer people with experience. So it goes back to that maxim of unusual avalanches require unusual precautions.
Yeah.
And, you know, as you're dealing with something that's unfamiliar, you have to really ratchet it back and add a much larger margin of safety than you might normally do.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's a great point. A question that's related from Brad. He's asking. He says, you mentioned the idea that experienced backcountry users were pushed further out into more obscure areas due to influx of new users. Do you have any evidence of that via trail usage, social media heat maps, or any other types of empirical evidence to support that theory?
That is a great question, and I'm going to disappoint Brad by saying that we don't have that empirical evidence yet. That's certainly things that we're looking at. You know, in the last couple of years, we've been looking pretty closely at the experience levels of people involved in accidents in Colorado. And, you know, with the sudden closures and dramatic changes we saw 2 Marches ago related to COVID, we definitely saw experienced backcountry users, you know, seeing their favorite areas tracked up all of a sudden and maybe going somewhere else, or have them tell us that they changed their plan during the day because they saw so many other people out there. So we've got lots of anecdotal evidence to support Brad's question, but we haven't been able to pull together that empirical evidence yet.
Yeah, it seems similar for up here too. Yeah, definitely seeing tracks way out in places that you just don't see tracks that often or haven't. Yeah, totally. Question coming in from Forrest. He's asking, is anyone tracking the number of avalanche fatalities normalized by the number of recreationists in avalanche terrain, or even better, number of person hours spent in avalanche terrain? He's kind of saying, you know, an avalanche fatality per 100,000 recreationists. I know a lot of different other, you know, like you read risk and fatality studies, and they use like the term millimort.
Yeah.
You know, do we have anything like that that's normalized for the?
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm going to disappoint Forrest as well. We have really good numbers on deaths. We can track that really well. Yeah. We don't have great numbers on involvements for the US, and we certainly don't have any sort of reliable numbers for the denominator on users or, exposure time. Those are really challenging things to do. In Colorado, we feel like we're doing a pretty good job capturing the number of people who are involved in avalanches.
Mm-hmm.
And we see somewhere between 6 and 12% of the people caught in avalanches get killed.
Mm. Yeah, do you have any guess on how many are unreported?
We can't know that, but we're, within Colorado, we're feeling pretty comfortable about capturing most of the serious involvements.
Yeah.
We don't have, as you move further out, we may not have as good numbers. And in Colorado, we certainly don't have those usage numbers to compare those rates.
Yeah, just another plug for submitting observations, everyone. If you see avalanches or involved in an avalanche, we'd love to hear about it by filling out an observation. It really does help this sort of thing. An anonymous person's asking if you have any, if you think climate change is probably a big question, if climate change contributed to any of the unusual snowpack from last season.
Probably.
Yeah.
But, drawing that direct link from the changing climate to our changing snow regimes and then to changing avalanche cycles gets really hard. We can take a longer view and say things are changing through time and make some pretty good guesses about how they might change in the future. But when we're starting to look at individual seasons or individual avalanches, it's a much harder connection to make.
Yeah, for sure. Eric's asking a question. I think I'll read into it. It's a pretty short question. It says, were the accidents further back than previous years? I suspect the question is getting at, were these accidents, these fatal accidents, or even involvements, were they in terrain that was further back than, like further back in the backcountry? Were they occurring because people were being pushed way back in there?
I can answer that for Colorado and say that fatalities weren't necessarily more remote.
Yeah.
But we did, we have seen involvements or groups in terrain that they may have been exploring for the first time or had moved into because some of their more usual areas were busier.
Yeah. Got it. Another question coming in. Let's see here. Asking about the percentage of caught and carried versus percent of experienced victims, i.e. do more new users get caught but not killed?
Again, I'm going to draw a little square around my data and say this information comes from Colorado. Because that's where I've been doing the research. And for the limited data that we've looked at and sort of the preliminary studies, we're not seeing big differences in degree of involvement. And we're not seeing that shift in involvement yet.
Question from Mark Moore, NWAC's former director. Do you or anyone at CAIC have any plans to correlate avalanche accidents or occurrences of unusually unstable snowpacks with NSAW and with the reemergence of La Nina? Do you have any thoughts about a repeat of some of last year's snowpack issues?
Yeah, Mark can certainly speak much better to your neck of the woods than I can. But we're already seeing similar conditions to last year set up. So, here in Colorado, we're seeing our first significant snows very similar to last year. So we're definitely thinking along those lines.
Yeah.
Mark was involved in work previously that was able to draw tighter correlations between NSAW and avalanche cycles and accidents in the Pacific Northwest.
Mhm.
And certainly along the coast, we see a much stronger correlation in weather and snowpack and NSAW than we do by the time everything reaches Colorado. It's all wrung out and we don't get any snow out of it anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And last thing here from someone named Ryan Butler. He's saying, hey, Spencer, I did some research this year on human factor influences in backcountry skiing and has some data to support your theory that the experience group was seeking less traffic locations to ski. So it sounds like perhaps you and Ryan should connect.
Yeah, awesome. I would love to hear from you, Ryan, or anybody else who's, Brad and Forrest were asking about various pieces of data that we haven't, we haven't had the time or the ability to collect. We know it's out there. So as people pull this information together, it would be great to see it or chat or collaborate.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. And then, I think our final question here is from Aaron Miller. Did Canada or European countries also see a spike in fatalities as we did?
I am going to dodge that question, Aaron. We had such a bad winter in Colorado that actually getting outside of my little square was pretty challenging. And I've been really focused on what's happened in the US and can't really speak to some of the challenges. They certainly had unusual snowpack conditions in Canada and some unusual accidents in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't rattle those numbers off the top of my head.
a lot of factors at play. Well, hey, Spencer, we really appreciate you joining us tonight and speaking about last season. And here's to a good year ahead. And thanks again. Good to see you.
Yes. Thanks for the invitation.